to the Wikimedia Research Showcase for June 2020. My name is Jalal Difala, and I will be your host for today. I co-organize this series of talks with my colleague Martin Gulac, who is posted now on IRC and a YouTube chat, waiting to collect your questions and relay them during the Q&A time. We are both research scientists here at the Foundation. Today, we have a very exciting and controversial theme about credibility and verifiability on the internet, and specifically on Wikipedia as well. To cover these topics, we are very glad to host two great speakers who are doing work in these areas. We will start with Connie Sehat from NewsQ and Hacks Hackers, who will talk about the project she's been leading to find and rank credible information from multiple news outlets and how this work relates to Wikipedia. Without further ado, Connie.
Terrific. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction, and lovely to be chatting with you here today. So I just wanted to share about our project a bit, and the way that I wanted to frame this was through a specific problem lens that I thought that the Wikimedia research community would find interesting. So through the challenge of information reliability. So I want to touch on this for a little bit, specifically through a news source perspective, and then share a little bit more in detail what the NewsQ project is, and then close with a couple of the ways that we've been working with members of the Wikimedia community. So on to that challenge. I don't think it would be news for many people here, but one of the ways that we understand some of the challenges to news itself comes from a historical perspective. And I will say that I'm definitely biased in that because my own background as an academic is as a historian of 20th century German history. So as historians write the record, they do rely on news sources. This doesn't mean that they take news sources verbatim. It's in fact the work of history to problematize this, to kind of think about questions related to context, among others, but that clearly evidence for the past and also current events does occur in news articles. And then this gets triangulated among other records. You don't have to fast forward though 100 years down the line to think about those works of history. Clearly, the reliable sources problem is here today from our perspective, and also pretty clear in terms of, say, something like Wikipedia grappling with the challenge of today's news and what news to cite. So, but when we think about today's news, it's just with that perspective that as opposed to news systems or news publishing of the past, today's news is quite conditioned by news ranking and recommendation systems, which do make certain sources of news more readily visible, for example, through virality. It's also, though, created opportunities for the broadening or the democratization of news providers. So we now know that there are news sources from smaller, sometimes one-person outfits, that didn't have the same publishing platform capacities as earlier. So one question that we ask in all this is, how does one conceive of a reliable source today? Is there something that may make a reliable source today a bit different compared to the past? Reliability might have to do with an answer to this question, for example. So we might think of the question of accuracy, the question of misinformation. This is definitely a consideration. But this doesn't really help us with the positive end of the spectrum. So then again, you might answer that reliability might also literally be to what extent people rely upon or interact with the information. But this also brings up a tricky question. So I think another question in this has to be as well, in what ways does the technology perhaps shape the news overall in itself? How do we understand that relationship? So one interesting dimension of this is the potential shift of what's sometimes termed news values, or what is considered newsworthy. So currently there is this hypothesis by journalism scholars Tony Harkup and Deidre O'Neill that there's an emergence of a new news value called shareability. And so this is related potentially to entertainment, which they observe has been a news value for a while, that things that are entertaining are of course partly what does make the news, but that this is something a little bit qualitatively different. And what really, though, defines what shareability is a little bit elusive. It's sometimes hard to grasp, but it's that thing that, as like one quote happened from a former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed UK, would be like that stuff that makes you laugh, the things that make you angry, and that this quest for shareable stories was in 2015 already hypothesized to be a likely important consideration for newsrooms as they generated news. What's a less academic way of putting this? So this quote seemed to be quite vivid. Nicolas Medina Mora, in terms of writing this story related to a pair of undocumented immigrant siblings who migrated to Connecticut in 2014, thought about it this way. I intended to repackage the boys' trauma into a digestible narrative I hoped would capture the attention of some 100,000 internet users who would then surrender valuable information about themselves to one or another technology baron, who would then reward the website for which I worked with a better starting position in the algorithmic rat race. All of this to say that this question of what makes the news is very tied to the technology. And so understanding questions like these are of interest. This interaction between news and the larger knowledge networks are of interest to NewsQ. So what's NewsQ? So we are an initiative of the Tao Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. It's a quite long title, and Hacks Hackers, that seeks to elevate quality journalism when algorithms rank and recommend news articles online. And we approach this problem by engaging in design thinking activities. To clarify some of these terms, what we mean by that, by news ranking and recommendation, here's this example from Apple News, for example, on the 26th of March, but take the results of different platform news products. And then here's another example in terms of Twitter's Explore capabilities under their news tab. So we just know, right, that given the amount of news or news-related content out there at scale, that there are a number of ways that technology companies use algorithms to rank and recommend content. And it's not just in products like these, but also through search, for example. And in terms of design thinking, if you're not familiar with it, we would just say that news ranking and recommendation in our eyes counts as what has been called a pretty wicked or complicated problem. So one that requires many kinds of approaches, initiatives, communities to come to the table and brainstorm ways forward. In particular, we focus on three kinds of design thinking around technical definitions, around ideations, around data, and creative prototypes. That can be kind of hard to understand off the bat. So just wanted to give a few examples of what this means. An example of an activity for us that is ideation around data is represented in our news ranking review panels, which have recently launched. So the question that we've been posing to our groups of journalists, mostly, also some media scholars, and then a representative of the platforms in each one of our panels has been, what news should go to the top? And so if you come away with the answer that it should be potentially more quality news or more reliable news, it's really trying to figure out how do we help move that conversation in a way to be quite specific, given that news ranking and recommendation algorithms are rule-based and process-oriented. And so they require that kind of technical specificity. What we're trying to get to is much more clarity around the concepts, but also to understand better what trade-offs might be involved. So, for example, take this question. Say that it's a journalistic value that more local news is important in news feeds, but what exactly counts as local news? Another question might be the place of opinion. That opinion might be important to have within news feeds as a part of a, say, public sphere or democratic process. But what are the places of opinion pieces within larger breaking news feeds? And then final question, just to kind of, again, clarify the specificity that we're looking for is, should the rules governing the ranking and recommendation for a science or health news feed, this is something quite apropos to now, should the rules governing that ranking and recommendation be different compared to another topic, such as politics? So to move forward and to see whether or not groups of journalists can potentially agree and come to consensus about how they think news ranking and recommendation systems might work or might take into account some of the values of journalism more. We're having these groups of, the groups of them to evaluate examples of news ranking and results, like these ones that you're seeing here today. We're having them compare news ranking results from 7 or 8 different news products across a certain amount of time, and just to kind of come up with this very evidence-driven way of having a conversation and to see what those recommendations might be. So that's an example for us of an activity that is an ideation around data. For the other two examples, I thought I'd share two activities that we are undertaking or will be undertaking with members of the Wikipedia community in mind. So for the first, in terms of technical definitions, so technical definitions is an area in which we try to get quite more clarity or achieve sort of more specific definitions related to what might be incorporated within a larger algorithm at scale related to news ranking and recommendation. We also seek, for example, more clarity around what it means to measure the results of news ranking and recommendation systems. So for us, one of the things that we've been quite interested in for a long time has been the English language Wikipedia perennial sources list. I'm going to assume that most people here know what that is, but just in case, if you aren't familiar with it, you'll quickly discover this. The way that I've articulated it is not so much the perennial sources list, but I sometimes call it the perennially discussed sources list. And so basically trying to think about a non-exhaustive list of sources where reliability and use on Wikipedia have been discussed and trying to figure out like what points consensus have been achieved. For those of you who already know this, it comes as no surprise, but sometimes actually the ways that the sources are discussed are quite granular. So for example, if you look at the ways that the sun is considered a generally unreliable source, there is this little note, for example, there that sports reporting, though, might be quite uncontroversial. So one of the things that we have done over the past year is to convert this data into a signal for our API, a database that's collecting a whole number of signals so that researchers can combine and sort of use these different potential signals or data related to a question of what quality news might mean, and try to use that as a way to sort of press like correlations or questions to understand like, well, what would make for a more interesting algorithm in this space? So we've done that on our own, but also one of the things that we're really excited about is the fact that a recent grant through a related initiative called the WikiCred initiative, and if you go to wikicred.org, you can see, are giving small seed grants related to credibility and reliability in the Wikipedia space or Wikimedia space. And so we do expect to see through the awarding of this recent grant Sorcerer that an API for the perennial sources list will be generated in the next year. Another example in terms of one of our activities is creative prototypes. And so for this particular activity, the question that we put to a number of folks has to be, what would it be like to strengthen reliable information related to vaccine safety worldwide in knowledge networks? And what is the relationship of news sourcing with that larger knowledge network overall? So for this activity, we have been in conversation with the WHO Vaccine Safety Net Secretariat, as well as the board of Wikimedia DC. We expect to see a certain number of activities, including editathons, to take place. We can announce more about that plan, hopefully in the next bit, but really just trying to figure out how do we brainstorm potential ways to strengthen these knowledge networks related to reliable information on vaccine safety. And again, that relationship to news sourcing. And the final thing, I guess, just to mention is that as an initiative that's interested in design thinking, we're always open and love conversations around other ideas to kind of help figure out what are ways that we can help collaborate, bring communities together, and find these very concrete, constructive ways forward to try and think about how do we conceive of the problem of news ranking and recommendation in terms of a more productive direction, but again, very concrete. So we're always open to those other ideas. That's it from my end. Thank you so much, and would love to hear any questions should you have them.
All right, thank you, Connie. Let's see if we have questions already in the room for Connie.
I have one question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Connie, thanks so much for your presentation. I have a question about the perennial sources list and the reliability of sources there. And my question is, to what extent are you using the external signals that external to Wikimedia signals that may exist for assessing and bringing them together for assessing the reliability of sources that Wikimedia uses on the projects?
Mhm.
If I understand correctly, there are nonprofit and for-profit organizations out there that are generating these scores and signals. At least like 5 or 6 that come to mind. And I wonder how much of those signals are you collecting or funneling as part of this work?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So for those that are sort of doing the kind of deep dive investigation into this space, I think one of the questions has been in the background, are there ways that algorithmically or sort of at scale, certain kinds of data can be brought together to, if you will, create a limited sort of like, what is that kind of higher set of what more quality information means, right? And so for us, the Wikipedia signal for the perennial sources list is something that we wanted to offer to a group of researchers exactly to ask that question with. So what we have done is that in our current database, we have approximately 12,000 news sites and information sources upon which we've collected more than 100 individual, what we call signals or elements of data. And they can range from everything like, for example, is there a ads.txt page on the site, which has sometimes been considered a proxy for quality in the sense of this site is honoring specific advertising network standards, to things like what percentage of a specific subset of pages on the site are, like, for example, devoted to ads, or if there's one of the companies has contributed a site related to the percentage of, say, profanity or hate speech safety related projects. So we have a list on our site of the number of signals that we have, at least we're able to kind of generate and say these are publicly defined. And then in terms of inviting people to our database, trying to see if they're interested, like, can they help us find some of those correlations? One small study that we hope to see come out over the summer has been asking this question related to, for example, the intersection between journalism prizes overall, the amount of profit related data that is tied to that site, so advertising data, and then this question of how much are they interacting or flagged by, for example, fact-checking organizations. So that's the same thing that we don't have yet any information on how Wikipedia is comparing according to that, but because we've made the data now recently available, we hope to see some of those questions explored. And that to that end, and I'll just put it in the IRC chat, we had a recent call for papers that was just concluded in partnership with the Social Science Research Council, in which we've told that those folks that come up with these plans to kind of generate news metrics, that we'd be happy to share our data with them for them to kind of continue to explore that. But if there are people that are interested in understanding that relationship with Wikipedia in general, like kind of more of a Wikipedia focused question, we'd be happy to explore that as well in terms of potentially sharing our data for that end.
Thank you so much.
I have a question. I think you mentioned the ads.txt as an example. And I think that's an interesting example because there's features that you might take into account that I think encourage like publishers to do better. You know, like if you're not doing well with ads.txt, you know, maybe you should add that to your site, and hopefully they do that in a like honest way. And that's like something that encourages them to do better. And I'm sure there's also features that are not easier to do better on, and so maybe they, you know, would tend to like try to game them or something like that. And I'm curious from kind of the Wikipedia standpoint, I mean, are there signal, you know, I guess, do you think about that as far as like signals from Wikipedia where if that signal became very important for news credibility on the web, that would encourage people to like improve Wikipedia content versus encourage people to try to like manipulate Wikipedia content? I'm just curious if you've thought about that kind of trade-off.
I think there are, from our perspective, that there are clearly some signals that are easier to game than others, right? Like, so for example, I would say ads.txt is relatively like kind of easy to game in the sense that there's not a lot of, like, there's not a lot of improvement, there's not a lot of loss. But we actually, the kinds of signals that we're more interested in are the ones that are quite difficult to game. So from our perspective, actually, why the Wikimedia or Wikipedia perennial sources list is interesting is because it is hard to game. It is a community-based discussion around specific sources. And so another example of something that's hard to game, for example, though, is like the presence of a byline from an author, right? So in the sense of like, if there's a correlation with authors that are more transparent about who they are, and then, you know, you've like basically asked people to just be more transparent about that, in the sense of whether or not it's sort of a bad actor, there are some things that if they improve in those things, it's like, it's actually probably good for the news ecosystem overall. So it's not going to be seen as that loss. And those are definitely the areas in which we think are quite promising. But I guess I would say this thing as well, is that I would say at this stage where we are mostly is trying to grapple with how difficult the problem is. And so our conversations with academics and with journalists and also with members of different platforms has mostly been focused on, you know, like this question of like, what does it mean to prioritize local news, especially given what's been called a local news desert problem, right? And this is a challenge because if you want to highlight and select local news right now, and there aren't very many local journalists, and so you highlight sort of what's possible or what's available, and let's just say it's not that interesting. Where are you supposed to go with that kind of conversation, number one, but also like, how is it going to be the case that what you prioritize for local news related to COVID versus local news related to politics, like is a different kind of approach? Like that contextual work is something that we're finding needs to be done still quite a lot of. The final thought might be also then too, one of the things that I've been intrigued by in terms of the Wikipedia perennial sources list is this granularity. I do think it kind of raises this question of there's a reliable sources problem and there's an article problem. And so if you decide that an article is reliable, but it's tied to a whole bunch of other information on that specific sources site that is less than reliable, what does that do for not only, what does that do for the news systems overall, like at scale? That for us is a kind of interesting question. So like the example of the Sun, clearly there's uncontroversial in terms of its quality related to sports, but very controversial in other areas, but they're linked. I mean, it's the same source. So that linkage for us is an interesting avenue of exploration.
There's a question from YouTube. Do you see opportunities for this work to feed back into how Wikipedia editors do research and select sources to use as references?
That's definitely been some of the conversations we've had with members of the Wikipedia community that we've been talking to, and in any case, that especially then through the work of the WikiCred, which is that wikicred.org initiative. One of the questions has, I think, been at least expressed to us by the members of the Wikipedia community that we've been talking to has been like, can you help editors understand a little bit more about what it would mean to choose a source and say this is reliable and this is not? So we'd love to see those conversations advance, and, you know, fingers crossed as they happen, but also open to suggestions from people in this community as to what might be productive in moving that forward. Some of the discussions that we've had too have been, for example, like, are there API related solutions for this, especially as you know, the number of news sources are so many? What would that be like? And so those are some of the exploratory conversations that at least I've been part of.
Thank you. And a follow-up question, if most of the sources that you showed from the perennial list seem to be English sources, yes. And there was a question from YouTube, if you're planning to assess sources in other languages from
yes, that will definitely be the case.
Russian, Polish.
Yeah. So this is actually, I would love to know more about this. I would say, yes, we definitely are. And especially that would happen first in our work related to vaccine safety. So we thought that we might kind of narrow the scope by choosing a specific topic. especially since the mandate of the WHO is to be international and multilingual. So that's one of the ways that we thought that we would kind of press that question forward. But it's been also our understanding that nothing like the perennial sources list quite exists always in each of the Wikipedia language communities. So one interesting question might be, is there a kind of broader multilingual conversations within the Wikipedia space of what might be happening related to the sources and source quality overall? We've loved talking to, for example, the members of the Scribe project related to how they're kind of thinking about making lesser available, like more content available on like less prioritized languages as part of this conversation, because one of this question of translating English language Wikipedia sources into another language, which we'll face with the vaccine safety network challenge, is that those sources are not in the same languages that we want to talk about. And so when it comes to linking to vaccine safety related resources, for example, in French or Arabic or say Spanish, we don't necessarily want to use the same sources, but there are quite a number of reliable sources related to vaccine safety in those other languages. So how can we help bridge that? Another challenge.
Do we have other questions from the room?
I have one.
So I have one question actually with respect to
sorry.
selecting and kind of trusting news outlets. So if you consider the different news outlets in different languages across the globe, there's like definitely a lot more than we can actually potentially handle. I was thinking whether you thought about having like a crowdsourced way to sort of weigh different sources and assigning them like a credibility score just by looking at how many times kind of people tweet or reshare or do something on a news outlet, like just to have something automatic to some extent.
So we actually haven't thought about that, how to generate that signal. We'd be interested in understanding if there are people who are interested in developing it independently. I will say that, right, because, how do I say this? So there's a couple of different ways in which, though, we think these other initiatives might advance the question. So the first is recognizing, of course, that the work of places like the Oxford Reuters Institute, which does a digital news report and does do actually public surveys of trust in many different countries and languages. That's been a starting place to kind of consider how different news sources are locally faring. But it's definitely, like, as you say, like nothing as broad as what already exists. The second consideration has been that maybe actually the Wikipedia approach in English has been quite fruitful in the sense of maybe it's more about discussing the problematic sources as opposed to everything, and that a sort of default understanding that everything might be quite acceptable in context, but that somehow some sources need more discussion might be sort of an interesting approach. The final thing is that we note that there are a couple of different initiatives out there that are trying from the journalism angle to figure out if there's metadata that they can include at their source level to help sort of indicate sort of why you should trust them. Like, for example, if they have an ethics policy or if they have a policy related to corrections. And so the Trust Project, for one, which is at the trustproject.org, as well as the Journalism Trust Initiative by Reporters Without Borders, these are different ways that are trying to generate standards, metadata standards, in which they might embed them on all of those news sites. And so then in a way, like maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be something that's like a signal, like, or a score that's generated, but then you would locate it within their own metadata on their homepage, for example, or at the article level. So those are some of the types of things that are happening, at least in terms of potentially being able to answer part of that question.
Yeah, very interesting. And I have actually a follow-up. So if we consider that news outlets can be heavily censored in many parts of the world, usually we'll find like independent journalists taking over by having blogs, like things that are like not necessarily official, right? So how do we deal with this kind of freestyle journalism sources of information?
So I think this is why there's so many different approaches right now to credibility and reliability that are happening at the source level, at the article level, and also at the sentence level, right? So depending, I think, on the news aggregator system, they're trying to approach this in those several ways. The ones related to claims, for example, like fact checking, those are things that are happening at the potentially like sentence level, which are definitely human annotated. But clearly there are also initiatives that are working on sort of assumptions of natural language processing and trying to figure out, is there something that we can do more granularly related to, for example, like it might not just be the facts that are of interest, but bias and tone. So I think that if the outfit doesn't have something, I will say that in terms of all the research I've seen lately, right, there is definitely this pushback to, not pushback, but the return to traditional sources. So it does seem that in general, publics are choosing traditional sources again. How the smaller little independent outfits fare in that, it's hard to say. I do know though, like for example, it's been on the mind of the people with Reporters Without Borders to try and figure out how can we make the lift less heavy in this sort of metadata algorithmic age to help them indicate on their, it's like sort of their news sites. And then one of the challenges will be if those information sources are coming from Facebook pages, for example, how can they like, embed that metadata or embed something that might offer that signal? So yeah, very, very tricky problem. And I do think it will, currently it will tend to, and we are seeing this right now already, that smaller outfits are harder to surface in this environment right now.
All right, thank you. Leila, do you have a question to?
Connie, I have one other follow-up question to my earlier question, which is, have you seen studies that try to compare the different scores that are being made available through NewsQ or, as you mentioned, Trust Project? There are other initiatives like Global Disinformation Index, Credibility Indicators, IFCN, signatories. Like, have you seen a study that tried to, maybe a qualitative study or quantitative study that has tried to understand, like, what are we gaining from each of these different scores and how do they compare with each other?
Yeah, no, I've not seen that yet. I would say that most of the work that I've seen so far has really more about been, oh, actually though, I do know of, I think an upcoming study that will happen, I think out of University of Texas at Austin. So I'll try to find that reference. But I think one of the questions has been that really more just trying to figure out how to lay the groundwork for how to understand the problem. And then of course, all these smaller solutions have come to the fore. So there are a couple initiatives I know of. Let me see if I can find their public reference because they still might be sort of incubating, but I don't know anything that is public quite yet, at least. Yeah.
Perfect. I would appreciate pointers if you have any. Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Thanks again, Connie, for the talk and answering all the questions. You offered me just before an excellent segue to the next talk. Will be Tiziano, PhD student from EPFL, who will be talking about citations in Wikipedia. And you were talking, Connie, about trying to identify facts at the sentence level, and it is like a good work that Tiziano will present now. All right, Tiziano, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you see my screen? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work. This is an effort in collaboration with Miriam of Wikimedia Foundation, Giovanni from University of Amsterdam, and Bob West, my advisor in EPFL. These are the people that collaborated in the article we presented recently in the web conference, but many people helped on the way, including Ba, Dario, Leila from Wikimedia Foundation, and Michele Catasta from Stanford University. So content integrity is the topic for today, and is one of the most crucial aspects for the existence of Wikipedia. One critical component to ensure that the content of the article is reliable is to cite the source of the information. According to the documentation of Wikipedia, citation allows the reader to determine if the referenced material supports the author argument. But what content should we reference in one article? If you look at the Wikipedia documentation, there is a detailed policy for the editors about the verifiability of content. And in few words, it says that the articles require inline citations for every statement that could be challenged by the readers. This policy led to the creation of the reference section at the bottom of the article, similar to the format used in the academic publications. In this example, we can see that the highlighted sentence has a footnote number that refers to the external website with the source of this information. So despite this crucial role of the citation on the verifiability of the content, very little is known about how readers use them, especially in this time that we are discussing about misinformation. The credibility crisis of the web, understanding how readers look for content online is extremely important to determine the policies and to also inform the design of the platform interface. Of course, this problem involves all the content online. We focus on Wikipedia because it's one of the most visited websites, but we are convinced that we can get good insights on the general behavior of the internet population. So to better understand the reader behavior, we investigate these three research questions. First, we need to understand to what extent readers' interaction with the citations. Then we want to understand what features of the page are more correlated with the interactions with the references. And finally, last question, we want to understand what features of the citation are correlated with more interactions. So I said interaction, but we have to define what interacting with a citation means. And for this reason, we identified 6 events that can happen in a page when a reader reads the content. First, page load is the basically an event that is recorded every time the page is loaded. Then we have a footnote click that indicates that the reader click on the reference number that causes the browser to jump in the footnote section. Then we have the complementary event, upclick, that causes the browser to jump in the context where the citation was used. Then we have the footnote over that is recorded when the pointer of the mouse is moved on a footnote number, and a small pop-up with a preview is shown. Then we have the click on the reference link, that is the actual action of going to the destination of the source of the information. And finally, we have the click on external link, that is a click on any link in the page, not in the reference section. We collected these events in English, in the English version of Wikipedia in 2 sessions of 1 month each, October 2018 and April 2019. This was the first time that this data was collected, and so we had to develop a client-side instrumentation to capture these events. I want to point out that to preserve the privacy of the reader, we included only anonymous users. That is the vast majority on Wikipedia. And we also anonymized the data by dropping sensitive information, and the original records, according to Wikipedia policy, are deleted after 90 days. We have similar values for the two data collections, so we focus on the most recent one, April 2019. In total, without considering the page loads, we collected more than 96 million events. And from a preliminary analysis, we can observe that 1 in 3 is an over event. That is very frequent, and is the majority is generated by a desktop device, because of course is not available on tablet and smartphone. The reference click is more common on again on desktop devices, and the up click, so jumping from the reference to the context of the citation, is a very rare event. In our analysis, we focus on the references, so we focus on these 4 events: reference click, over, up click, and footnote click. So research question number 1: to what extent do users engage with citation when reading Wikipedia? First of all, we have to define the metric we want to use to measure the level of engagement. One classic approach is to look at the click-through rate. And in our case, we define a custom version by considering positive a page load where there is at least 1 click in the reference section, 1 or more. And in simple word, we can define as what is the probability of observing at least 1 click given a random page load. And this number is 1 in 340, relatively small. In other terms, it means that 0.29% of the page loads have at least 1 click in the reference section. As we saw before, over event is more frequent, and given a random page load, we can observe a over event in 1 case every 70 page views. Another interesting analysis to understand the user behavior is to study the transition probabilities. So given that the data that we collected is a event stream, we can study the sequence of events and model the transition probability. In more technically, we can generate a sort of Markov chain of order 1. And here we can see a summary of some interesting transitions that define how the reader behave on the page. We can see, for example, that 1 page load is followed by another page load 46.9% of the time. The footnote click is followed by a reference click 33% of the time, indicating that the click on the footnote number is a good predictor of clicking on the reference link. Differently, over is rarely followed by a click on the reference click, only 1.1% of the time. And a reader tends to explore the reference by going from preview to preview, where we can observe more than 28% of the time over followed by another over. Another aspect that characterizes the user behavior is where the reader go when they click on a reference. In terms of the most clicked domains, we noted that Google leads the ranking, followed by DOI and some news outlets. By looking at the full domain, we observe that the majority of the traffic directed to Google is towards the domain books. In one details that is not in this plot is that the actual most common destination is Internet Archive. That is a website that archive web pages for to ensure that there are no broken links. And it was more than 8 million, it received more than 8 million clicks. And for this plot, we extracted the original link and we merged with the relative domain. So takeaway of question 1, 1 in 340 page loads has a click on the references. 1 in 70 page loads has over events, is more common. And the most frequent destination for the outgoing traffic from Wikipedia are Google subdomains, scientific articles, and news websites. Research question number 2. Now we have a global view of what readers interact with interreference, and we can move to our second question. What are the features of the page that are predictive of an interaction with the references? To answer this question, we identify 52 features of the page, such as page length, the number of references, popularity of the page, and using ORES, that is the Wikipedia scoring platform, we obtain the quality and the topics distribution for each article. The topic distribution in particular is a topic vector of 40, in this case, 42 indicators. We use ORES version 2, if I remember well. 42 indicators that can be interpreted as the probability that an article belongs to each of these topics. And since one article can belong to multiple topics, they are independent variable between 0 and 1. So to study the impact of these features on the interaction with a reference, we train a logistic regression, simple logistic regression, to predict if a page load will be followed by an interaction with the references. In particular, by observing the importance of the feature, we can notice that the quality is a strong negative predictor, meaning that low quality articles are more correlated with interactions with the references. On the other side, we can see that language and literature, that is mainly biographies, and internet culture are positive predictor of interactions with the reference. So since the quality is a strong negative predictor, we decided to investigate more on this feature. And we are interested to understand what is the effect of quality on the click-through rate. And in this case, a naive approach is to compare the click-through rate of low-quality article and high-quality articles, but this would not take into account the possible effect of confounding variables. For example, if all the articles with low quality were about a specific topic, we cannot separate the effect of quality from the topic. So more concretely, we know that language and literature articles tend to receive more click on the references. And in this context, if most of them were low quality, it would be harder to disentangle the two. So for this reason, we proceeded with a matched observational study. The goal is to compare the click-through rate of pairs of articles, one high quality and one low quality, that are identical in all the other features, to observe the actual impact of the quality on the click-through rate. So to define this matching, some technicality, we use the propensity score that gives us a way to obtain the probability of being treated, in this case being high quality, as a function of the other observed covariates. The method uses a logistic regression to learn the probability of belonging to one of the two classes given the set of features. And the matching is obtained by creating pairs, one high and one low quality, that minimize the distance in this probability function. In this way, we obtain a matched dataset of more than 800,000 samples with all the feature balance, as you can see in this example on the right. So with this mesh dataset, we were able to study the click-through rate of the two quality classes. In this plot, we visualize the difference in the click-through rate in function of the probability of the popularity of the page. On the y-axis, we have click-through rate, and x-axis, the popularity of the page, defined as number of page views. And we can notice two effects. First, there is a negative correlation between the popularity of the page and the click-through rate. And second, there is a consistent and also statistically significant difference in click-through rate between high quality and low quality. The first effect, the negative correlation, it could be explained by different type of audience that visit the page. For example, popular pages have a very broad audience, while unpopular pages can have a very focused set of readers. The interpretation for the second effect, the higher click-through rate for low quality articles, could be that the pages with incomplete information cause the reader to click on the reference in search for more content. Note that in this case, this would imply that the reader click on the references not to validate the content of information, but to get more content that is not offered by the page. So the article, in other terms, the article does not satisfy the information need. To investigate this aspect, we also run a similar analysis. These more details are in the paper. And we use as a treatment not the quality, but the length of the article, and we obtain even stronger results. So takeaway of research question number 2 is that readers tend to interact more on references of pages with limited content, short articles, and with poor quality. And the popularity, popular articles have lower click-through rate. So moving to our research question number 3, we want to understand what features of the citation predict if a reader will click or not on the link. And for each reference, we extracted the text in the reference itself and the sentence where the footnote appears. We represented these two sentences as a binary bag of words. And we had the two constraints. We take the negative sample as a negative sample, the closest sentence in the page to be sure we minimize the effect of, to be sure that basically the reader read the sentence where he didn't click. And we use only one pair per session to avoid to overrepresent users. And to study the words that are correlated with high interaction, similarly to the previous case, we train a logistic regression to predict the interaction. And we study the features in the same way. And the results show that people interact more with recent content. For example, 2019, open access content. We at the top we have a free and PDF terms, and sentences describing human aspect. For example, born, died, relationship, family, wife. This last result is confirmed also by Empath. That is a tool to generate lexical categories from text. And we noticed that the categories more frequently clicked are about human factors, such as, again, wedding, family, children, death, and so on. So in conclusion, to answer this three research question, for research question 1, we noticed that the click it happens one time in 340 page loads. More frequent it happens for the over event 1 in 70. Then a reader tends to engage more with references on short pages, and in relative terms, popular pages show less interaction with the references. And third, readers engage more with the references about recent events, describing human aspect and offering open access. So what are the implications? For the first time, we observed how readers interact with citations. And this can help researchers to develop novel theories about information needs, can help in editor in put a priority in improving what to improve in terms of information reliability. And we observe, we confirm data-driven the importance of open access and open science initiatives. What does it mean in practice for Wikipedia? We can design models to predict the lack of information by using the signal from the interaction pattern. As I said, it may be the case that a lot of click indicates that the page doesn't satisfy the information need of the users. We can prioritize the content to expand based on this interaction level, and we can prioritize the sentence that needs a reference based on the reader interest. Thank you for attention. If you have questions, happy to answer.
All right, thanks Tiziano for this very insightful presentation. Let's turn now to our room and guests to see if we have questions. Otherwise, Martin, I think you have some questions from YouTube. You can voice them out.
Yes, there's lots of discussion on the YouTube channel. The first question is whether you checked how these results compare to other wikis, if there's some variation, if you checked it, or if you have any, you can speculate.
If the question is in different languages, no, we didn't check because collecting this data was approved basically at English Wikipedia level. We try to observe the difference in English Wikipedia by looking at different source geolocation of the reader. It was not a significant difference. There was some difference in the topic, not in terms of engagement. In the topic, there was some difference. Like in aligned with other research, India was more interested in scientific topic or about education than, for example, about American stars. And this was correlated with a different level of engagement. But except for this, we didn't see any major change in these results.
Thanks. Another question was raised with respect to use of Wikipedia in the context of schools. So whether, or that it was speculated that students may have especially high interest in drilling into sources, and that we know that from over the school year, different times of the year, this has a huge impact on, or huge variation in page views. So I guess it depends on when you collected the data.
Yeah, this is
if you can make any statements about that.
Yeah, of course, there are differences during the year. This was April, so we should. There was not much going on in that month. Like in another data collection, we previously was a pilot study, and there was a World Cup football. There was a huge interest for a sport topic, but in that case, we didn't have any specific topic that emerged. But I agree that there are seasonal effects based on what's happening in the world. But I don't have more insights about. But I can say that the topic that apparently are more that attract more clicks are biographies. It was consistent across the different data collections. So people tend more to look at additional information that are not on Wikipedia, like pictures that are not on Wikipedia. By really looking at the content, we see that someone get married and they want to see the pictures. Of course, extremely human kind of behavior. And it's not, Wikipedia is not a platform for this kind of content.
And one follow-up to the content is related to the features which could predict click-through rate, was about whether you looked into polarity, or let's say how controversial the topic of the page is, whether that, maybe you didn't look at it, but if it could add to how likely readers are to actually check the references, because that would actually be a good sign, but it's not so clear maybe.
We didn't run a study by looking at popularity.
Not popularity, the polarity.
Yes, sorry, yes.
Okay.
We didn't look into it, but politics was not a topic with high click-through rate. This for sure by looking at the topic in the logistic regression.
If I may interject here, I have a question, Tiziano, related to this. Did you look at features of the page, such as like frequency of edit in the past month, or like anything that can be correlated with polarization or polarity of activity on an article?
No, we didn't go in that direction.
Do you have other questions from the room?
I have one comment, and Tiziano, bear with me and let me know if I'm thinking about this correctly. So I'm going to do something which is relatively unscientific, but hopefully is going to be helpful in thinking long-term about the impact of the work. So you showed the result that in English Wikipedia, 1 out of 340 page loads on pages that have at least one reference results in a reference check. And I'm looking at the numbers from English Wikipedia, and what we see is that we roughly have around 11 billion page views on a monthly basis from 8.8 million unique devices. And let's say for a second, these unique devices are people. We know all the caveats that we can't really map unique devices to people. So this, if I'm doing the math correctly, means that roughly each unique device on average checks references around 3% of the time in a given month. And I wanna encourage us as a community and as researchers, as we are thinking about this space, to think about whether we are ballpark in the right place. Do we want people to engage more with references and actually go and check what is in the references more often? Or is this something that we're happy about? This can be a high number. And I've had different interactions with different editors hearing about these numbers and saying, some saying, oh, wow, I didn't think so many people actually check the references as a reaction to 1 out of 340. And some saying that, well, this is low and we want to do more of. And I want to encourage more conversations in this space to think about, do we want people to engage more? And if yes, with the citations, and if yes, in what ways we want to make that happen. I just want to put it out there. And Tiziano, if you have any comments on it, by all means, and it's okay if you also don't.
No, it's interesting that there is an inverse correlation. More quality means less interaction. So it's something that should be explored more. Understand if is for real that Wikipedia for that article doesn't satisfy the information needs. So we should do something more qualitative to understand why someone clicked on that reference.
Okay, I have one kind of question, which sort of bridges to our previous talk from Connie. I was wondering if, Tiziano, if you looked into whether kind of the reputation of the destination kind of domain kind of plays a role in actually checking on the citation or not. And the idea here is basically, if you see that the reference is actually, I don't know, from NASA or whatever, then the person says, okay, it's reliable enough, I'm not going to click. So I'm wondering if this is going to be like a negative or a positive signal there. And maybe also Connie can follow up on that.
No, we didn't spend too much we actually started to classify the destination, try to assign a topic and a credibility score, but it was too much to go in that direction. So we don't have insights on this.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, this question of, I love this observation that you found this inverse relationship between high quality articles and clicks, because in a way it just seems to me, that might be great in the sense that people come to maybe that means that people they come to Wikipedia, they generally trust the citations. They're like, look, the people who are writing this page, we trust that they are citing things appropriately. So then it's like the question is, when are they clicking? Are they clicking in moments where they definitely want to contest? So they see that citation from a source that seems like less than reliable. And I feel like I've seen some of those discussions in the reliable sources page, like discussing, actually the source related to the Quillette source. So people kind of discussing whether or not they felt that this reference was appropriate for this particular article. So clearly there are moments in which people are clicking that way, but then this other question of you're finding that there are these human moments in which people are clicking. So that almost means like Wikipedia as an avenue for discovery. And like in a way, like, oh, like here's the general information to help me understand this, but actually I want to go deeper. So I'm going to go deeper and I'm going to go into these citations because these are avenues that I can go deeper. Just kind of a cool way to sort of think about it. Like, could that be the mode that most people are coming to Wikipedia in terms of the reference section, where maybe like definitely with my hat on recently in terms of credibility, I've been thinking about like, okay, evidence and trying to make sure that things are all tightly cited, but this other possibility for people to just discover more content. And so, yeah, I don't know, it offers a kind of interesting avenue, right? In terms of thinking about that way that people are engaging with references as your study has been exploring. Could there be this qualitative way to understand what those clicks or those sort of that dive means? And then what does that mean then? Does that redound back to the reliable sources question? Does that mean that some of these sources are seen as, yes, these are great avenues to kind of understand more? Whereas in these other cases where, in fact, let's say the page history is quite contested and maybe it's a locked page or all of those particular sources, like, is there something to be understood there?
Do we see actually having multiple citations for a given fact in Wikipedia? And basically, have you looked at which citations or which references, like among like 1 or 3 citations for a given fact, are being clicked? Just wondering. Okay.
You mean the most clickable or?
Yeah, like given a fact, given a sentence, and then there are like 2 or 3 citations. Did you check if like people would tend to check them all or check the first one?
No, but this is part of the third resource question. So basically, if there are 3 references, you interact with one of them, we take as a negative sample the closest that you did interact with. So basically, we didn't do a study by looking each of them, but it emerged into features of the logistic regression. So the one that have words that are more related to family or open access or recent tend to be clicked more. And this is given by this matched setup where they have to, positive and negative, they have to appear as close as possible in the context.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Do we have other questions from the room or YouTube? Okay, I think we are at time anyway. So with this, let me close out the June showcase. This has been like a very exciting and engaging showcase. I thank the speakers, Connie and Tiziano, for that. Also, everyone in the audience who tuned in. As a spoiler alert, next month we are going to have talks about medical content in Wikipedia. We hope to see you then. And with that, have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Bye.